I think we will have to stop with the questions. I'm sorry, but we have to go to the Turkish case, which is also very interesting and very informative. And also want to remind you that we have a panel afterwards on Tunisia, which I think is ultimately going to be the real proof that Islam and democracy are compatible and that democracy is possible in the Arab world. So I think it will be a very interesting panel at 2 o'clock, right after this panel on Turkey. So I would like to invite the panelists, Dr. Kamal and Dr. How do you say your first name? Sorry. Thank you. How do you say it? Gunul. Okay. Dr. Gunul. And we also have a speaker from Istanbul. Unfortunately, he was not able to make it. Dr. Kamal, how are you? Welcome. So he will join us by Skype later on. And our goal was to have a real debate about what's going on in Turkey. So I think we brought some really important experts on the topic. And this, as you know, for all of us, Turkey was the model and Turkey was the hope for the whole region and for the Muslim world. So we wanted to evaluate how things are going and where Turkey is going these days. And Professor Asma Afsaruddin, the chair of the board, is going to moderate this panel. So please.
Okay. Thank you, Radwan. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm delighted to welcome you to this keynote panel on Turkey, which is, of course, a very important country, and particularly for the whole purpose or project. In fact, until quite recently, Turkey was considered almost universally as a model of Islamic democracy. And that image has been considerably challenged by recent events, particularly by the attempted coup on July 15, 2016, that left in its wake almost 250 civilian casualties. And President Erdogan of Turkey moved swiftly to squelch remaining vestiges of the uprising, cracking down on those who were deemed to have instigated and supported the coup attempt. And those arrested included supporters of the Gulen movement, as well as subsequently journalists and members of the intelligentsia, among others. Supporters of Erdogan and his government have justified these steps as necessary security measures appropriate in the aftermath of an attempted coup that is understood to be not only a domestic attack, but also an external plot by foreign elements. Detractors of the government and critics of these measures paint a different picture. They have instead accused Erdogan of placing Turkish democracy on a path to self-destruction from which there seems to be no exit, as a recent Foreign Affairs article claimed. So the conversation we're about to have on this panel is a very important one. The future of Turkey has enormous implications for the future of democracy in the Middle East and in the Islamic world in general. And many of us, like myself, who are enormously fond of Turkey and its people and wish them well, are anxiously monitoring the situation. We have 3 speakers today, one of whom will be joining us by Skype, who are extraordinarily qualified to explain to us the complexities of the situation from a number of different perspectives. So without further delay, I turn to our first speaker. Actually, we didn't quite discuss the order, but I'm going to go ahead and volunteer Kamal Kirishji, who is a senior fellow and director of the Turkey Project at the Brookings Institution. Speakers will speak for about 10 minutes or so, and after the last speaker has been Skyped in, then we will take questions from the floor. Kamal.
Thank you, Asma, and thank you to Ridvan for inviting me and us here to discuss Turkey and where it's heading. Thank you to the keynote speaker as well. I share this enthusiasm for democracy and democratization in the Arab world. I also noted how Ridvan referred to Turkey, how Turkey was once a model. That's where I'd like to start with my remarks and then say a few words about what seems to have gone wrong. I was a university professor when AKP got elected in November 2002. I was deeply involved in European integration studies, and the arrival of AKP, having broken away from an earlier Islamist party and its agenda that was uncomfortable with liberal markets, uncomfortable with the notion of civil rights and human rights across the board, only for Muslims as they define them as Muslims, and also extremely uncomfortable with the Turkish Republic Western vocation. AKP brought a whiff of fresh air, excited many in Turkey. We must also underline that reform in Turkey did not start with AKP. It started earlier on, but the arrival of AKP in many ways propelled the country. And at the time, Erdogan put together a very wide coalition that included Kurds, liberal, centrists, as well as those of you who follow the academic literature, Muslim Democrats, a fascinating term, I think epitomizing the possibility of Islam and democracy coexisting and working hand in hand. And I think at the time the West was mesmerized too on the heels of 9/11 that indeed AKP was going to transform a Western-oriented republic which always had difficulties with its diversity, managing this diversity, and difficulty with its democracy. And chapeau to Erdogan and AKP, they did achieve that. When I recall where we stood just about 10 years ago, yes, Turkey was a model. And in exactly 10 years ago, Turkey also got elected to the United Nations Security Council for the first time since 1961 with a huge majority. It was at the peak of its soft power. Well, we are not there. We are not there, and what was exciting about that period I'd like to underline is the way in which AKP brought a formula to manage and live with Turkey's diversity. And to me, the best symbol of that was the way in which AKP permitted LGBT parades in Turkey in 2003, which continued until 2 or 3 years ago. Today, we stand somewhere completely different, and I think Asma has just summarized where we are, so I won't go into the details of it. But share with you some thoughts on what is it that brought us here. I cannot claim that I have a convincing answer for this. There were many factors that played a role in this. I just rushed out from a conference at Brookings called The Anatomy of Illiberal States. And the panel from which I had to leave prematurely looked at Hungary, Poland, and Turkey. When I listened to the presentations from Hungary and Poland, I really was shocked. The similarities are unbelievable. Similarities in the way in which leaders, I won't mention names, in those countries and in my country began to dismantle the institution of these countries, primarily the rule of law. Second similarity is the way in which the very pillar of democracy, which is elections, the way in which these leaders, I'm not naming names, these leaders tinkered with what one speaker said, the technology of elections, and told us how, for example, in the recent Hungarian elections, the Hungarian election system went literally dead for 4 hours. You can imagine what might have happened in those 4 hours. And in our experience, it was a cat that had entered a trafo, an electrical unit that brought out. So we wonder what will be happening on the 24th of June, and maybe in questions and answers we may go back to it. Time is very limited, but I think one way in which to explain this, drift away from not only liberal democracy, but the very pillars of democracy is power, and the determination to stay on power, and the ability to feel Machiavellianism in your own genes as you move forward to maintain that power and manipulate the system. However, this is where I'd like to come up with my own thinking that I developed, and please allow me to do some propaganda in a book I just published called Turkey and the West, is the following, and relates to the keynote speech, Islam and Democracy. Erdogan and his immediate entourage comes from an Islamist movement that in Turkey we call Milli Görüş, the national outlook. Time is very limited, but when you go into the intellectual tradition of this movement and read the literature from some of the leading personalities, I'd like to share one name because it's a name that is frequently raised and mentioned and referred to by the Turkish president, is Necip Fazıl Kısakürek. And what Kısakürek advises in his writings is that Muslims should have the right to elect a leader and then defer governance to the leader, lock, stock, and barrel. And he calls that leader Baş Yüce, the chief leader. I recommend to you to look up in the internet the law that paved the way to the referendum in April 2017 for the constitutional amendments. In the preamble of that law, you will see references, very natural references, to previous Turkish leaders like Süleyman Demirel, Turgut Özal, etc., quoting them, advocating a presidential system that will kick in right after the elections, if the elections are won by AKP and the current Turkish president. Though I must qualify what I just said, we'll come back to it. But out of the blue, there is reference to this particular personality. Now, this is a personality that represents a political movement that has an extremely narrow view of democracy, if it has, and it's a view that is totally majoritarian. That is, if I win the elections, I have the right to express the will of the people on behalf of the people without regarding the interests and the rights of those who have not voted. And that, to me, is the difference between where Turkey was when Ridvan referred to Turkey as was a model and where we stand. And it would be a real pity if the Arab world was to adopt this particular understanding of democracy in Turkey, if we can still call it a democracy. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for staying admirably within the time limit. Our next speaker is Gönül Tol, who is the founding director of the Center for Turkish Studies at the Middle East Institute.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Ridwan, for inviting us. This is a very nice discussion, and I enjoyed the discussion on Saudi and Iran relations earlier, so thank you so much. Well, when I got the invitation, I initially wanted to talk about Turkey's illiberal state tradition, a state-centric tradition that the AKP ruling party inherited, and how the AKP's neoliberalism played a role in Turkey's current drift into authoritarianism. But then I remembered that I was going to be on a panel with an AKP official. So I decided to cover the things that I wanted an AKP official to address. So that's what I will be covering today. Well, I wish he spoke earlier because I also wanted to hear what he had to say. We're very familiar with the AKP narrative, but he's addressing a Western audience, so I'm hoping that he'll give sincere answers. So the AKP narrative is that the country is going through a difficult patch, especially after the failed coup in 2016, and that explains all the steps that the government has taken so far that led to an authoritarian regime. But Turkey had a pure human rights record even before the attempted coup in 2016. In the wake of the mass protests, for instance, in 2013, many of you might recall, they erupted in Istanbul and spread to other cities. The government continued a policy of controlling the media and the internet and clamping down on its critics. Right after, following the corruption allegations in December 2013, and the corruption allegations implicated people who were close to Erdogan, in Erdogan's close circle, the government intensified its meddling in criminal justice system, reassigning judges, reassigning prosecutors and police, and attempted to exert a greater influence and control over the country's already very politicized judiciary. And since last year's 2016 coup attempt, of course, the human rights situation is much worse. After the coup attempt, the government, there's now a state of emergency in place, and after having declared the state of emergency, the Council of Ministers issued several emergency decrees with force of law, granting unlimited discretionary power to the executive. And I believe one of the most contentious issues concerns the extension of police powers to detain suspects for up to 30 days without judicial review. Of course, if you follow Turkey, there are serious problems with the freedom of expression and freedom of association. The Committee to Protect Journalists, for instance, ranked Turkey the worst jailer of journalists in the world. Turkish police have raided offices and detained the editor and 12 senior staff of one of Turkey's oldest left-wing newspaper called Cumhuriyet, alleging that they had published content that was that attempted to legitimize the coup attempt. Just yesterday, a Turkish court sentenced 14 staff of the newspaper to up to 7 years in prison on terrorism charges. According to Reporters Without Borders, a Turkey representative, the journalists were mistreated in prison, including being kept in isolation. In addition to opposition press, the opposition parties are also the target. 12 deputies, including 2 co-chairs of the pro-Kurdish People's Democratic Party, and that is the 3rd largest party in the Turkish parliament. They have been detained for, I quote, making propaganda for a terrorist organization. Since July 15, more than 100,000 civil servants have been suspended or dismissed without any investigation or without any possibility of legal challenge. And these individuals, what is even more concerning is that these individuals are all banned for life from working in public sector, and their titles, their ranks, and their licenses have been revoked for all time. The passports of those who have been dismissed or who are under investigation, and also as well as the passports of their children, their wives, they have been canceled. So I think all of these measures are being applied with an alarming level of arbitrariness. The measures are aimed at those who, I quote, according to the law, belong to, connect to, or contact with, end of quote, alleged terrorist organizations. But of course, the criteria for assessing membership of these organizations is incredibly vague. They have not been specified. And that is partly due to the vague anti-terror definition, and that's always been a problem. But I think currently the government is also, and that was one of the conditions actually the EU has imposed. The EU has been asking Turkey to change that anti-terrorism law, and so far Turkey has failed to do so. Because I believe the government is using the coup attempt as a pretext for clamping down on its critics and using this law. The latest targets of the government's campaign has been a guy named Osman Kavala. He is the biggest, Turkey's best-known philanthropist and liberal activist. He's in jail now, and along with an American professor who is teaching at Lehigh University. His name is Henri Barki. He was attending an academic conference in Istanbul at the time of the coup, and after pro-government media accused him of orchestrating the coup on behalf of the CIA, a prosecutor issued a warrant for his arrest. And one of the two charges against the philanthropist, Osman Kavala, is, I quote, being in contact with Henri Barki and foreigners who were among the organizers of the coup attempt. Just last week, it was particularly heartbreaking for me, being the mother of a young baby, a Turkish teacher who was sentenced to 1 year and 3 months in prison for allegedly praising terrorism. She was sent to jail with her 6-month-old baby. And she was charged with terrorism after she said on a TV show, "Don't let children die." That was all. Human rights activists, lawyers are in jail on terrorism charges, and most of these cases, accusations of terrorism, are based solely on actions such as downloading data, data protection software, or publishing opinions disagreeing with the government's narrative on the Gülen movement, for instance.
One more minute, good wrap up.
And the situation on the Kurdish front is even worse. As I said earlier, the opposition, the pro-Kurdish party's co-chair is in jail, and according to UN High Commissioner of Human Rights, they documented numerous cases of excessive use of force, killings, and forced disappearances. And I think the most concerning is the massive scale of dismissals of public officials, again, including members of the pro-Kurdish party. And I think all these measures they have all resulted in human rights abuses. These are part of President Erdogan's strategy to consolidate his power and rally the people behind his presidentialism agenda by creating the narrative that Turkey is surrounded by enemies inside, internal and external enemies, and only a strong president can save the country. And of course, this has regional implications. I won't go into detail because we don't have enough time, but I want to say one last thing, and I will also refer to the keynote speaker's comments earlier. He said that the US is not really interested in promoting democracy in the world anymore. For a long time, the US turned a blind eye to whatever is happening in Turkish democracy for the sake of greater geostrategic interests. But in the current context, I don't think the US can afford to do that, because what is happening inside Turkey is undercutting US interests in the region. And the case in point is the anti-Kurdish policies that the government is pursuing both domestically and in Syria. And I'll end with that. Thank you.